Madam Ambassador, welcome to
Thank you very much.
HADATH, and we are always happy to have you among us.
It's always a pleasure to be here.
Thank you, ma'am. I would like to start with the Yemen draft. You are the pen holder on that. You distributed revision 2 yesterday to the 10 non-permanent members. Today, the 15 has met in the first sort of negotiation on the subject. But there are those who say, it's a difficult process. We will not have a resolution this week. Next week, the Council is going to China, and hence they are saying there is no need for a resolution. What do you say to them?
Well, we think there is a need for a resolution because the situation, the humanitarian situation, facing between 8.5 and 14 million Yemenis is very dire. There's a serious risk of a catastrophic famine of the scale that has not been seen in the world for several years. Supplies need to get through. Fighting needs to de-escalate. We had a very powerful briefing last Friday in the Security Council from the Special Envoy, the Emergency Relief Coordinator and the head of the World Food Programme. And they were united in making 5 requests of the Security Council.
But why don't you have the 5 requests enshrined in a presidential statement or a resolution? Only the 5, if that's your main concern, the humanitarian situation in Yemen.
Well, the reason for going for a resolution is the seriousness of the situation on the ground. We've had what are called presidential statements before. A resolution is the next stage, if you like, in the seriousness, communicating the seriousness with which the Security Council takes an issue, and then after a resolution of the type we've drafted, you might get on to a Chapter 7, which is a legally binding resolution. So there are various gradations in what are called Security Council texts.
But we do have under Chapter 7 resolution like 2216, which was under Chapter 7, and it was never implemented by the Houthi side, although there was a time limitation on the implementation. However, Kuwait, your partner in the negotiation within the Council, yesterday spoke to the press, and he criticized the rush into issuing or getting a resolution passed from the Security Council. He also picked on few points within the resolution. Why do we have to have, they say, a resolution before the talks in Stockholm? Why don't we have it afterwards?
Well, it's very possible we might want to have another resolution after the talks. We haven't yet got a timetable for when we put this resolution to the vote.
Do you think it's this week?
I'm not going to be drawn on that. We'll see how we go. But the most important thing, I think, is that we heard a very powerful briefing from the UN with 5 humanitarian requests. We want a resolution to put those requests into practice.
They also argue that it emboldens the Houthis. The Houthis, as you know, on Sunday declared that they are abiding by the ceasefire. They're stopping. Yesterday alone, they sent another missile towards Saudi Arabia, which fell in Yemen, actually. There is a letter from the Yemeni government dated the 19th yesterday, which was delivered to the Security Council. I'm sure you have seen it. It enumerates the violations by the Houthis to the humanitarian international law in Hodeidah. With all these, while the Saudis and the Emiratis, the leaders of coalition, this morning announcing $500 million. Riyam al-Hashimi, the Minister of State for the Emirates for International Cooperation, and Dr. Abdullah Rabi'a from the King Salman Humanitarian and Emergency Center have announced $500 million to feed 10 to 12 million Yemenis. If we compare the two actions of the two sides of the conflict, it's really starking.
Well, the two sides are not equivalent, as you say, and the money from Saudi Arabia and the Emirates is extremely welcome. But one of the problems with Yemen is that it's not just about buying supplies, it's about getting them into Yemen and getting them distributed to the people who need them. I repeat, if people don't get these commercial and humanitarian supplies, they will starve to death. That's a very serious, imminent catastrophe, and the resolution aims to do something about that.
Yes. Yeah, you keep mentioning the humanitarian side, which is very, very important. But why didn't you limit the resolution, they argue, to the humanitarian side?
Well, the resolution is primarily to deliver the 5 asks that the UN made of the Security Council. So it talks about a cessation of hostilities in Hadada so the aid and commercial supplies can get through and get distributed. It talks about a greater access for humanitarian supplies across Yemen. It talks about the need for donors to do more, and the money you've just described from the Emirates and others is extremely welcome. And it talks about support for the political process, which is Martin Griffiths and Stockholm or Sweden. Yes. And we obviously want all the parties to engage constructively with the Special Envoy. And the resolution is unlikely to go into the detail of that, precisely because the UN Special Envoy's work is ongoing.
Yes, he's putting the frame in negotiation with them. Have you seen this frame of work?
No, we haven't seen it yet, but what the Special Envoy, what Martin Griffiths said in the Security Council last Friday was that he would refine it and then he would bring it to the Security Council for endorsement to aid the political process. And I think everyone on the Security Council is ready to support Martin to the hilt to make this work.
We have seen the goodwill shown by the legitimate government of Yemen. They have already announced that they're going to the Stockholm talks in comparison to the Houthis, which yet to announce their commitment to attend. But would you be surprised at all in the face of these missiles attacks if they continue, and also the violations of humanitarian international law in Yemen, which the letter from the Yemeni government stipulate and enumerate? Would you be surprised at all if we fail to start the talks in Sweden?
I think Martin Griffiths was very frank that it is not certain that it will be possible to have talks in Sweden. But he was also very frank that there is now a window of opportunity. So what we want to do as the UK, but what I think all members of the Security Council want to do, is make clear our support for Martin to try and make that window of opportunity come good and the talks happen. We look to the Houthis. We have condemned the attacks from the Houthis on Saudi and Emirati territory, and we will continue to do so. And obviously getting those stopped has to be a priority of confidence-building measures beforehand.
We all know that there are 3 reference points or references to the whole process. The Gulf GCC initiative, that's in the regional level, the national outcomes of the national dialogue on the national level, and there's of course United Nations resolution, especially 2216 on the international level. Yet the draft resolution that the British mission put forward does not even mention the other 2 references, only mention the United Nations resolution. Why is that?
Well, I'm not going to comment on the detail of the resolution because these things remain private until they're published for tabling. But it certainly calls for all parties to implement previous instructions from the Security Council, and that includes 2216.
Yeah, but that's what the Yemeni diplomats and the Arab diplomats are saying, that it does not even mention the GCC initiative and the outcomes of the national dialogue.
Well, it would be possible to, in theory, add a reference, but those 2 things, though important, are not Security Council or UN initiatives. And on the whole, not always, but on the whole, resolutions tend to concentrate on what the UN and the Security Council have done.
Also, we heard the Kuwaiti yesterday, Ambassador of Kuwait, Mansour Ratabi, mentioning that operational paragraph number 1, OPP1, does not, it calls on the parties to implement United Nations resolutions. He said, why doesn't it demand the implementation?
Well, we'll see how negotiations go. It's certainly an option to go for demands, but this is the first resolution of its type since 2216. So by convention, the early resolutions tend to have slightly softer language, but it is perfectly possible to ramp that language up, either in this resolution or subsequent resolutions. What we want to do is track what's happening on the ground. There have been some very welcome moves, including from the coalition. There was an undertaking by the Houthis to stop ballistic missile and drone attacks.
They did not.
But fighting is still, we understand, continuing. So obviously the resolution will need to reflect the real situation on the ground, and we will be refining the text over the coming days with the rest of the Security Council.
Yeah.
I also ought to say, sorry to interrupt
Yes,
you, that we do consult the Saudi and Emirati governments on the text. They are not on the Security Council, so they will
Through
not
the
have.
Kuwaiti.
Well, no, sometimes we do it direct as well,
Yeah.
out of courtesy. Obviously, they're not on the Security Council, so they don't participate in the negotiations.
There's a paragraph we heard from diplomats also calls on all parties to conflict to facilitate unhindered flow of commercial and humanitarian food, water and fuel and medicine. The government of Yemen has a problem with the word fuel because they argued with me that the Iranians actually finance the Houthis through oil, and that even the decree number 75, which they suspended, and the United Nations thanked them for that, exclude oil. Why did you include fuel when there's a mechanism, if legitimate, for legitimate companies to buy and sell fuel?
Well, as I say, I'm not going to go into the detail of the text of the resolution, but one of the problems is that some of the measures that have been taken have made it harder for supplies to get to the Yemeni people, and this is having an effect on sanitation, it's having an effect on health, it's having an effect on nutrition. The UN want to negotiate arrangements on the ground so that all these supplies get to communities where they're needed. That fundamentally is what we're trying to help the UN do.
We do wish you the very best of luck in the good work you're doing for Yemen. I still have one question on Yemen. The resolution calls for the cessation of hostilities in Hodeidah indefinitely. There is no set time to end this ceasefire, but there is no mechanism for monitoring, like the violation that took place yesterday and the violation that's continuing today in the fight in the Hodeidah. We have no monitoring. Why don't we have a monitoring mechanism of the Security Council set up so to ascertain who is the guilty party, who is breaking the violation, and to actually to deter any party from breaking this agreement of cessation of hostilities?
Well, the primary purpose of the cessation of hostilities is so supplies can get through. Yes. So that's why it's limited to Hodeidah Governorate and the port. It is possible, in theory, to put a monitoring force in, but it will take a very long time. So the focus at the moment is getting the existing UN mechanisms on the ground to do the reporting to the Secretary General, who then comes to report to the Security Council.
Do you see a possibility of having further resolution in the future after the talks, if they take place under Chapter 7?
I don't want to speculate,
Yes.
but I think the way these things work best is if, after there is a success, the Security Council enshrines that in a resolution so that the parties are clear that the international community expects them to implement what they've signed up to.
Is there any possibility of holding the talks in Stockholm without having a resolution issued here at the Security Council?
There's a lot of possibilities. It might not actually be Stockholm, in fact, it might be somewhere else in Sweden.
Yes.
So I just wanted to explain that. We'll have to see how things unfold over the next few days on the ground and what sort of progress is being made. What drives the resolution, though, is the impending famine and the need to get aid and commercial supplies to nearly 14 million Yemenis, and that's the most important thing.
And you can see the coalition today with their announcement of 500 million. They're doing their best to do that, just that. I'd like to move to Syria. The UN Special Envoy to Syria, Mr. Stefan de Mistura, said that the credibility, balance, inclusion, and international legitimacy remain the litmus test for the constitutional committee that he wants to form. Now, if he fails in forming this constitutional committee, the UN fails in doing that by the end of this year, do you think Secretary General Guterres should go ahead and implement what he has said, that the United Nations is out of this process?
I would not describe it as the UN failing. I think it's the Syrians and the Russians failing. You know, they signed up at Sochi, which was a Russian meeting, and this was a Russian plan. And then you had the Istanbul summit a couple of weekends ago, where President Putin recommitted to the Constitutional Committee. So I think the Russians, as well as the Syrians, have a very serious question to answer about why, therefore, the Constitutional Committee isn't set up. But I think, yes, if the UN cannot help with the Constitutional Committee on the lines envisaged, then the UN should not be party to a charade, and the UN should step back from the political process until such time as the Syrians and the Russians are ready to ask for its help on a serious basis.
And hence delivering the whole file of Syria to Russia.
Well, you could look at it that way, but if I were Russia, I'd be very careful about what I wished for. If they really think they can run Syria and hold Syria, that's a very interesting
Good luck.
Calculation, but there will be no reconstruction money from the West.
Okay.
There will be no refugee return at scale, and there will be no rehabilitation for Syria in the international community if the UN is not involved in a viable process.
I have 1 minute, one last question. I'd like to, first of all, to congratulate you on the Eritrea resolution which you passed and lifted the sanctions on Eritrea, giving hope to other nations who have sanctions. And the whole process of peace in that part of Africa between Eritrea and Ethiopia started in Jeddah with a summit on the 16th of September under the auspices of King Salman of Saudi Arabia. Can you tell us the importance of that resolution? And I have 1 minute.
It's very important. His Majesty the King, the Ethiopian Prime Minister, the leaders in Eritrea, Somali, Djibouti, all to be congratulated for the progress they've made and their regional neighbours. It's important for the future of Eritrea. It's also important as a signal that to the rest of the world, in a way, that sanctions can be lifted if you do the right thing.
Ambassador Karen Pierce, the United Kingdom permanent rep to the United Nations, we thank you.
Thank you very much.
We always appreciate your presence with us.
It's always a pleasure to be here.